The English band Argent is a band from the early and middle 1970s that, at least in my opinion, should have been remembered as one of the great progressive rock bands of that era. They certainly had the talent, to be sure. Their keyboard player, the band's namesake, Rod Argent, had made a great name for himself prior to the founding of Argent in 1969 with his British invasion band, the Zombies. Rod Argent was a great singer and songwriter and a great keyboard player, very adept on the Fender Rhodes piano, on the Hammond organ, and later on the Moog synthesizer. Argent's guitar player, Russ Ballard, was equally talented, a terrific singer, and a great guitarist and songwriter. The band's rhythm section, which consisted of Rod Argent's cousin, the late Jim Rodford, on bass, and Bob Henrit on drums, were also quite talented. Sadly, this band, however, has been relegated to one-hit wonder status, at least in North America. That one hit was a terrific one, their 1972 song, Hold Your Head Up, from their album from that same year, All Together Now. But this is a band that I always thought should have done much better. I had thought for a number of years that they may, in fact, have actually been sabotaged by their record label, CBS Records. There's an interesting story there that I'm going to share in this episode. Rod Argent's band, the Zombies, were not distributed by CBS Records, at least not initially. Their big hits in North America, 1964's She's Not There and 1965's Tell Her No, were distributed in North America by London Records, specifically by their Parrot Records subsidiary. London Records was the American arm of the British Decca Records company. By 1967, Decca Records had all but given up on the Zombies. They had made numerous singles for the label, but with only Tell Her No and She's Not There charting well, Decca decided to cut their losses and cut the band from their label. The Zombies would re-sign with CBS Records, and in 1967 would cut a classic album for CBS at Abbey Road Studios, that album being the great Odessey and Oracle. Odessey and Oracle, for fans who may not be familiar, contains the Zombies' last big hit in North America, Time of the Season, released in late 1968. The story of Odessey and Oracle and Time of the Season, however, is an interesting one that may have put Rod Argent at odds with CBS Records. By late 1967, before Odessey and Oracle was released, the Zombies elected to break up. They were getting tired of playing very small venues for very little pay, and at that point decided that they would be better off pursuing other ventures. When Odessey and Oracle was released by CBS in the UK in early 1968, CBS Records in the United States did not pick up the album. It would take a number of months before the album would ultimately be released in the US. In mid-1968, the musician Al Kooper, who, in addition to having a great pedigree, what having played with the Blues Project, the early version of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and as a solo artist, particularly on the album Super Session, had at this point established himself as an artist and repertoire man for CBS Records in the United States. And on a visit to the UK, Cooper picked up a copy of Odessey and Oracle, reviewed it, and thought that it had hit potential in the United States, encouraging the head of CBS Records, Clive Davis, to put the album out in North America. Cooper's instincts here were solid. Odessey and Oracle became a sleeper hit in North America, and Time of the Season became a big hit on the top 40 charts. A big enough hit to where Clive Davis, not being aware that the Zombies were no longer in existence, demanded a follow-up. Rod Argent would tell the story of his interactions with Clive Davis on this matter in print in April of 1969. This was covered in a regional magazine in the United States called Go Magazine, a magazine that served the New York, Philadelphia, and various other major outlets in the United States through radio stations that were located in those various cities. Go Magazine, as an interesting sidebar, was one of the first American entertainment ventures that was pursued by the somewhat infamous Robin Leach, best known in the late 70s and early 80s for his syndicated television program, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. In Go Magazine, Rod Argent told the story of hearing from an animated Clive Davis who demanded a follow-up from the Zombies to Odessey and Oracle, and specifically for the single Time of the Season. Argent, rather nonplussed and a bit irritated at this demand, apparently let Davis know under no uncertain terms that the Zombies were finished and were not going to be able to be regrouped. At this point, Rod Argent already had a contract for his band Argent with the CBS label and advised Davis that, of course, he would deliver an Argent album to the label per that contract, but that the Zombies were no more and that he just needed to cool down a little bit. Yet another interesting sidebar around the Zombies, because of the fact that Time of the Season was such a huge hit in the United States, but the band was no longer available to tour behind it, several versions of Fake Zombies were put on the road in 1969 to capitalize. One of those bands was based in the Dallas, Texas area and actually included two future members of ZZ Top, Dusty Hill and Frank Beard. Oh boy, the interesting bloodlines we could draw in rock and roll, to be sure. But again, that's a sidebar comment. Following the success of the Odessey and Oracle album and of Time of the Season as a single, one would think that CBS Records would have promoted Argent and their first album rather heavily. And it appears that they did, at least for a short time, promote the band through Billboard magazine and the other weeklies that served the music industry back in the late 1960s and early 70s. But amazingly, neither of Argent's first two albums would even place on the Billboard Top 200 chart. Certainly, a band with a pedigree like this should have done better. What makes it all the more interesting is that one of the songs on Argent's first album, Russ Ballard's Liar, would be covered only a few months after Argent released the song by Three Dog Night, who would have a moderate-sized hit with it. As I mentioned, the biggest splash that Argent would make in the United States would be with the album All Together Now and with the single Hold Your Head Up. Hold Your Head Up would make it to number 5 on the top 40, and the All Together Now album would make it to number 23. But at least in North America, that was really the only significant chart action that Argent would have. The follow-up album that they would make, In Deep, would only make it to number 90 on the Billboard charts in North America. This despite having a great anthem of its own on the album, God Gave Rock and Roll to You, a song which several years later, in 1991, Kiss would resurrect as part of their soundtrack commitment for the film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, although their version of the song contained some rewritten lyrics provided by Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley in order for them to claim a songwriting credit for the song away from Russ Ballard. You could argue about how much talent Kiss has as a band, but Stanley and Simmons knew how to play the angles in the record business, that's for certain. Following the relative failure of In Deep, Argent would only make minor ripples on the North American charts. CBS would ultimately cut the band from their roster, and the band would move to RCA. By this time, Russ Ballard had separated from the band as well. As a solo artist, he had moderate success providing songs to bands like Hello. Their hit single, New York Groove, would be covered later in 1978 by Ace Frehley of Kiss, probably establishing the connection for Kiss picking up God Gave Rock and Roll to You later. Russ Ballard also wrote Since You've Been Gone, a great song performed by Rainbow during the days that Graham Bonnet worked with them as their lead singer. As you can tell by the various cover versions and songs that Russ Ballard in particular had written for other artists, this was a band that was very talented, and it is a shame that they did not go further. At least in my opinion, Argent definitely deserves to be better remembered. So getting back to the question I raised at the beginning of the episode, did Clive Davis and CBS Records tank Argent's career? I can certainly understand why Rod Argent might have thought so, but I think the answer to the question is probably not. Obviously, Davis was very annoyed that Argent wasn't more responsive to his request for a Zombies follow-up single. But in middle and late 1969, Clive Davis had more than enough work to do with other acts on the label. By mid-1969, Davis had two very big hit acts on his hands in Blood, Sweat, and Tears and with Chicago Transit Authority, later to be known as just Chicago. The band Santana would release its first album directly coming from the Woodstock Festival in August 69, and Janis Joplin would, in late 1969, issue her first album as a solo, I Got Them Old Cosmic Blues Again, Mama, which, while fans of Joplin don't view this as being one of her stronger efforts, certainly was a highly anticipated album at the time. Given all this activity at the label, it's perhaps understandable that after a brief flurry of promotional activity in Billboard in late 1969 and early 70, that Argent might have fallen through the cracks. CBS, of course, was a very big label, and not necessarily a label where an act would have wanted to be if they weren't showing definite and short-term potential. Frustrating certainly for Rod Argent and for Argent the band, but where they were the beneficiaries of good timing with Time of the Season, that good timing had quickly shifted by the end of 1969. And unfortunately, aside from the great success of Hold Your Head Up in 1972, success would be elusive to Argent over the course of their career. And it's a shame. Anyway, that is all for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it as always. Feel free to leave comments. I'll do my best to respond. And if you're not a member of Propaganda yet, of course, please join us. We will be back very soon. You take good care. Bye-bye.